This time of the year, by the way, next weekend we'll find an Advent wreath here. Time flies when you're having fun. But this time of the year is a time for us to reflect on the end times, to reflect on our lives. I know some of you do an examination of conscience before you go to the sacrament of reconciliation. Others of you do a weekly or a daily examine of your conscience. This time of the year is a good time for us to examine our lives, where we've been, where we're going, our successes and our failures, what's important to us, what we live our lives for, what we serve, and what we're willing to lay down our lives for. And as I was looking over my life this past week, many interesting stories arose, and one came up that I thought that I could use for the beginning of my homily on this, the solemnity of Christ, the King of the universe. And it's a story about my childhood. I grew up between Carlisle and Shippensburg in the middle of nowhere amidst a bunch of farms. There were no other kids to play with. Our closest friends were about 5 miles away, and we rarely got together with them. And so my two brothers, my sister, and I, we would play together. Peggy wasn't born yet. And so it was the four of us, and we would play games, and we would make up games, and we would compete. And we compete fiercely with one another for titles such as King of the Universe. Of course, we played some games to be champion of the United States, and then we'd have a playoff for the champion of the world or the champion of the universe. It's all very competitive. It was all for power. Even my sister came up with her own game. We made up a lot of games in those days. And my sister's game was this: who could be nicest to Colleen? Yeah, with 3 brothers, she needed this game. The game would last about 5 minutes because that's about as long as my brothers and I could take it. And partly because the prize wasn't that great. You know, you became the best brother. So what? It was always nice winning, being crowned, having the power of being the champion, the king. But it was never nice when the other person won. None of us wanted to subject ourselves to someone else. And there was an arrogance that came with those titles. Pride. Today's feast goes back to 1925 by Pope Pius XI. And it was instituted at the end of the First World War, when the monarchies across Europe came crumbling down and were replaced by democracies. And it was at that time that the church felt that it was necessary for us to be reminded on a yearly basis that there is a king worthy of following. That there is a king who is worthy of our trust. A king worthy of our humility and our humble submission to him. In a world disillusioned by power and authority, the church needs to remind us, we need to be reminded that there are those we can trust, and that there is ultimately one that we can follow from life through death to everlasting life. While we reject the notion of worldly kings and are unwilling to bow down, to fall to our knees to earthly powers, we genuflect every time we come into the church to the King of Kings. We kneel through the Eucharistic prayer as we humble ourselves before the one who loves us so much. We bow our heads before we receive him into the temples of our bodies. We acknowledge one King. Today's gospel passage places this King in juxtaposition with Pilate, a worldly authority, who stood on behalf of the emperor, the king of the Roman Empire. He stood before one who commanded the greatest of world armies at the time, who was served and dressed in fine clothes and ate good food. And before this worldly king stood one who was bound, beaten, and bruised, who was surrounded by no worldly army. Not even friends stood at his side. And yet he was threatened. Because Christ came to proclaim the truth. Imagine that for a moment. A leader that speaks the truth. In the midst of war, conflict, arguments, it is said that truth is the first casualty. We see that in the world around us all the time. And yet he was willing to suffer for that truth, to lay down his life for that truth, to proclaim to us God's unconditional love, his sacrificial love, a way of life that changes everything. And while Pilate and Caesar and that mighty army and that mighty empire of Rome would soon collapse, the power of his word endures and commands the hearts of many. And so on this weekend, the last of our liturgical year, I invite you to ask yourselves a couple questions. Does Christ reign in my heart? We all bow down. We all genuflect. We all fall to our knees. But does he truly reign in my heart? In my life? Am I loyal to the King of Kings? The one who lays down his life for me? As I reflected on this question, I found myself asking another question. Is there room for him to reign in my life? Because as I looked at my own life, I realized that I had already put somebody on his throne. It was myself. We grow up in a culture where we seek the power, where we seek to be number one. We grow up in a world where we're told to do it our own way. That the true authority over what is right and wrong, the true authority over what is true and false, is ourselves sitting on that throne of judgment in our own lives. As we prepare to enter into a new liturgical year, the Advent season, a season of anticipation where we anticipate our celebration of his coming into the world, the King of Kings, and we look forward to his coming to us in glory at the end of the age. Do we do so with him reigning in our hearts? Maybe we need to first step down from that throne and in humility receive the one who loves us more than we could ever love ourselves, who has in store for us far greater treasures than we could ever imagine or achieve. As we celebrate this feast day of Christ the King, May he reign in our hearts. And may we follow him.